If you're shopping for a compact luxury sedan in America and you'd like a plug-in hybrid, you have exactly two options at the moment. We have this new second-generation BMW 330e, and then we have the Volvo S60 T8. But the two vehicles couldn't be more different if they had tried. This BMW is not only the most efficient BMW 3 Series available in the United States, if you qualify for the full federal tax credit, it's also the least expensive at $2,536 less than a BMW 330i. And this is really a no-compromises plug-in hybrid versus the 330i. We get the same 0 to 60 time, we get better fuel economy, and an all-electric range, all for about $2,500 less. Since most luxury car shoppers are going to qualify for the full federal tax credit, you should really consider the 330e, not the 330i, to be the entry-level BMW 3 Series in the United States. And the Volvo S60 T8 is quite different. It's actually the range-topping model, so it's the best performing, significantly faster than this 330e right here, but it's going to be more expensive. As you'd expect out of a modern BMW, we have full LED headlights up front, active grille shutters right here. They are in their closed position. There's a radar cruise control sensor right down there at the bottom of the bumper. Be sure and let me know what you think about the design of this Generation 3 Series in the comment section. It is certainly less controversial than the grille that we find in the BMW 4 Series. At 185.7 inches long, the 3 Series is sort of middle of the pack in terms of exterior dimensions. But BMW has a surprising way of packaging their vehicles incredibly efficiently. So even though we have this incredibly long hood profile up front designed for 3-liter inline 6 engines to be fitted there, we actually have more interior room than we find in the vast majority of the competition. There are a few vehicles that will give us a bit more real-world rear seat legroom, like the Volvo S60, but the S60 is a front-wheel drive based vehicle and it's 2 inches longer than the 3 Series. The only way you can tell on the outside that this is the electrified version of the 3 Series is that we have a charge door on the driver's side. So if you're looking for a plug-in hybrid that definitely flies below the radar, consider the 330e. We have the same tail lamps and the same exhaust tips that we find in the rest of the 3 Series lineup. At first glance, the 330e and the 330i look pretty similar under the hood. They both have 2-liter 4-cylinder turbocharged engines. But you'll notice that we have the orange electric cables for the high voltage system hiding over there on the left side of the engine bay, and the engine itself is not exactly the same as the one in the 330i. This one produces less power. It's 181 horsepower and 221 pound-feet of torque. Basically, this is the more efficient, lower output version of that same 2-liter 4-cylinder that we find in the 330e. It's mated to a new electric motor that's more powerful than it was in the previous generation 330e, now producing 111 horsepower and 196 pound-feet of torque to give this 288 horsepower and 310 pound-feet of torque combined. According to BMW, that will get you 0 to 60 in exactly the same time as the 330i. Even though this has a little bit more oomph, we have more weight because of the battery in the back. Thanks to the more powerful electric motor, this is now capable of operating in EV mode up to 87 miles an hour, and thanks to the bigger 12 kilowatt-hour battery in the back, this will now have a range of 23 miles if you choose rear-wheel drive. If you choose all-wheel drive, that drops down to 20 miles, because this is a mechanical all-wheel drive system. So if you're looking for something that's a bit more sure-footed than the Volvo S60 T8, which is not a mechanical all-wheel drive system, you would want to take a look at the 330e. The all-wheel drive system is exactly as capable as the one that we find in the 330i, because it's exactly the same all-wheel drive system. The downside to that is fuel economy. When operating as a hybrid, the all-wheel drive model will get just 25 mpg. If you get the rear-wheel drive model like I'm driving today, that goes up to 28 mpg. Both of those figures are going to be below the Volvo at 30 mpg combined, but its electric range is shorter than this at 22 miles. Charge times will vary based on the kind of EVSE that you have access to. It comes with a level 1 EVSE, so just 120 volts here, and this will charge the battery from completely empty to completely full in about 13 hours. I suspect that most plug-in hybrid shoppers will be just fine with the level 1 EVSE because you should be able to charge the vehicle almost entirely overnight. If you're in a hurry, you'll want to install a level 2 EVSE. If you do that, this will charge at 3.7 kilowatts. That's enough to get this battery completely full in a little under 4 hours. As with most modern BMWs, I find the front seats to be quite comfortable. This is a multi-way adjustable power driver seat. We also have a power passenger seat in this vehicle. We have inflatable side bolsters and a 4-way adjustable lumbar support. The thigh cushion extension is manual. Unlike some of the options from Acura and Lexus that you might want to cross-shop with the BMW 3 Series, the front passenger seat has exactly the same range of motion as the driver's seat. We also have a tilt telescopic steering column that has a really nice range of motion. On paper, the 3 Series has one of the largest back seats available in this segment, but there does seem to be a bit of a variation in the way that some manufacturers are calculating legroom, so you will find a slightly more accommodating back seat in some of the competition. You'll notice that especially if I were to try and move over to the right side, where this front seat is all the way back in its tracks, And it is really tricky to get over here, and my knees are definitely digging into this seat back. On the other hand, as we see in quite a number of European vehicles, headroom is still quite generous back here. If I put my head all the way back to this headrest, my head is just barely touching the ceiling, but in a more natural seating position, I have about an inch of headroom left. If I move over to the middle seat position, there's still a reasonable amount of headroom, but remember, this is a compact sedan. So the 3 Series is not far off something like a Honda Civic or a Toyota Corolla in terms of its exterior dimensions, but on the inside, in many ways, the rear seats are more comfortable and more accommodating than the average compact sedan. The only real compromise, which honestly ends up being not much of a compromise at all for getting the plug-in hybrid system, is right back here in the cargo area. The trunk shrinks from the largest trunk in this segment down to sort of average at 13 cubic feet. That may not sound enormous, but remember that the non-plug-in hybrid version of the Volvo, which is 2 inches longer than this, has a trunk of 11.6 cubic feet. Simply opening the trunk lid doesn't make the change obvious because the cargo load floor is pretty level with the opening of the trunk. But in a regular BMW 3 Series, it's actually quite a lot lower, and we can lower this trunk down to this position where we have kind of an oddly stepped cargo area. You can fit a 22-inch roller bag here or behind. But even though this trunk is a little funky shaped, it is still bigger than the one that we find in a lot of the competition, and we have the ability to use that area for auxiliary storage right there. As with most of the European competition, we don't find a spare tire available in the 330e. There's nothing going on under the load floor, but we do find a 12-volt lead-acid battery under there. As we look around the interior, keep in mind that even though this is theoretically the least expensive 3 Series, this model has about $14,000 or $15,000 of options on it, bringing the MSRP of this particular trim to just under $60,000. We have a fairly large moonroof, although it's not a complete panoramic-style moonroof. It goes to just over the driver and front passengers' heads. The driver and front passenger get fixed height shoulder belts, 4-way adjustable headrests, and you'll notice that when that front seat is all the way back, that due to the size of this vehicle, that front seat back cushion definitely is way behind the front door. As we see in other BMWs, there are a ton of different upholstery options. These seats are heated but not ventilated in this particular model. We have the inflatable side bolsters there, and you can see the extending thigh cushion up front. As you'd expect out of a sedan in this price category, the front doors are made mainly from soft touch materials. So we have some stitched goods right there in the middle matching the seat color, soft touch injection molded upper section of the door, and then the lower section of the door has sort of a rubbery treatment to it, I guess you could say. It's not quite like a slush molded injection plastic, but it definitely has a soft touch and more premium feel to it. We have a sort of bottle holder right there, storage cubby, that speaker grill, and then just above the speaker grill, you see one of the strips for the ambient lighting. The ambient lighting continues over on the dashboard. There are a ton of different trim options in the 3 Series. This is one of the real wood trims. It has a really glossy coating, so it's a little bit difficult to show you what that looks like. Below that, we have a very similar texture to the bottom of the doors. So this is not a hard plastic at the bottom of the dash, but it's just not as squishy as the plastics on the upper section of the dash. This is a combination bin and slot style glove compartment. I was not able to fit a 10-inch tablet inside. In the middle of the dashboard, we find the latest BMW iDrive infotainment system. This is a touchscreen, and this model supports finger gestures as well. I've always thought the finger gestures were a little bit odd and somewhat gimmicky, but basically you can rotate your finger like this in front of the screen or that way and increase and decrease the volume. You can change tracks and do a number of other things based on finger gestures, although personally I find it easier just to use the buttons on the steering wheel. The rest of the interface should be pretty familiar if you've used BMW's iDrive lately. This is basically the same software that we see in most of the BMWs currently on sale in the US. Below that, we have 2 large air vents, the controls for the dual zone automatic climate control system, and then a button for the active safety systems. You can enable, disable, and put it into a customizable mode there. There's also a 3rd climate control zone for the rear passengers. You would use the menu inside iDrive in order to control that from the front. We have controls for the infotainment system right here, so physical volume knob, direct access buttons to various features right there. These are not just radio presets, but you can actually assign them to various features inside iDrive and then track forward, backward over there on the right side. There's a Qi wireless charging mat under this little door right here. You can see the wood trim there just a little bit better. And larger smartphones just barely fit in there, so definitely keep that in mind. This case that I have on my iPhone 12 Max is just a little bit too big, so it's a really tight squeeze. We have a USB port there, 2 large cup holders right there, and then the shifter here. Control for the BMW iDrive system right over there. To the left of the shifter, we have a long line of buttons. Stability and traction control, enable, disable, 360-degree camera, parking sensors. This tells the plug-in hybrid system to charge the battery. engine start, stop button, drive mode selectors here, sport, hybrid, electric, adaptive. And then depending on the drive mode that you get, there are some additional options. So for instance, electric has standard and individual. Individual is customizable. We have hybrid standard and hybrid eco pro, and then we have sport, standard, extra boost, and individual. Inside we find a fairly shallow storage area. Remember, this is a rear wheel drive vehicle. We have a USB-C charge only port inside. The instrument cluster is a full LCD unit. As you can see, it changes styles based on the drive mode that you're in. So if we're in the hybrid or electric modes, we have more of a power gauge style display rather than the tachometer that we find in sport mode. In the middle of everything, there's a moving map display, although it's not quite as exciting as the moving map displays that we find in modern Audis with the gorgeous satellite imagery. But with this one, you don't have to pay to keep the display looking the way that it is when you buy the vehicle. This car has one of BMW's M Sport packages, so we have a steering wheel with a little M logo down there at the bottom. There's a button for the heated steering wheel function right there in the middle of this bottom spoke. Paddle shifters on the back of the steering wheel. The controls for the adaptive cruise control system over here on the left. The controls for the infotainment system over here on the right. When you get the 330e out on the road, you'll notice that this feels like a slightly heavier 330i. But the weight increase comes almost entirely in the back, so this actually has a slightly lighter front end than we find in some of the other 3 Series variants. 0 to 60 happened in this model in 5.6 seconds. That's exactly what BMW quotes for the 330e, but a little bit slower than the 330i. BMW's tendency to underpromise and overdeliver seems to be primarily focused on their regular gasoline models. Those typically go a little quicker 0 to 60 than BMW's quoted time. This one is exactly on the nose. It's worth noting that if you get the all-wheel drive version of the 330i, then traction helps that go 0 to 60 a little bit faster, but in the 330e, the added weight actually makes it slower than the model that I'm driving here. In my 60 to 0 braking test, thanks to the wide 255 with tires, this model stopped in a nice and short 109 feet. That's definitely very good for a compact luxury sedan. And the weight is not too noticeable until you really start driving this harder out on your favorite winding mountain road. We do have a 12 kilowatt hour battery pack back there, so obviously that adds weight to the vehicle. But BMW has done a good job of trying to keep the weight increase in check. And by locating the battery in the back, BMW has actually given this a slightly more advantageous weight balance because it makes the front end lighter, it makes it feel a little bit more willing to turn in, but you will definitely notice that this is a little bit heavier. But the big thing to know is that dynamically, this is still very much a BMW 3 Series. This one's a rear-wheel drive model. You can get their rear-wheel biased all-wheel drive system if you'd prefer, but any way you slice it, this is going to be a very well-balanced driving machine. Very different than what we see in the Volvo S60 T8, because in the S60, there is no mechanical connection between the front wheels and the back wheels. It has over 300 horsepower on the front wheels, and then 80 some odd on the back wheels to give you 400 horsepower total. The weird quirk with the Volvo hybrid system is that even though it is incredibly fast, it is more than a full second faster 0 to 60 than this, you can get torque steer and oversteer at the same time on the right road surface. Really tight corners, if you floor it, you can get the front end breaking loose and kind of pulling and tugging the steering wheel. Well, the rear end is also stepping out on you. It's a really peculiar feel. The extra weight of the battery pack does change the way the 330e rides versus the 330i, but the changes are actually quite subtle. One of the problems with trying to compare vehicles like this back to back, especially on a dealer lot, is that there are so many different options and tire packages that you can have on your 330i and your 330e that finding a valid exact comparison can be a little bit tricky. If you hunt long enough, you should be able to find comparably equipped vehicles on your local BMW dealer lot. If you're really interested in the difference between the two, I would suggest doing that. In my cabin noise test at 50 miles an hour, I measured 70.5 decibels in here. That is a little bit louder than some of the competition, but I think that mainly has to do with the tire size on this particular model. According to the EPA, this model should be averaging 28 miles per gallon when operating purely as a hybrid. I've been averaging 27.5, so pretty close, but that is less than what you'll see in the Volvo S60 T8, and that has considerably more power, 400 horsepower versus 288 in this model. As far as electric operation goes, I was able to get a little over 22 miles of electric range. This is surprisingly efficient when operating in EV mode. If you keep your speed in check, say under 75 miles an hour, you should be able to average about 3.8 to 3.9 miles per kilowatt hour. What surprised me about that is that that is considerably more efficient than the EPA numbers would indicate, and actually pretty similar to some of the most efficient EVs that are currently out on the market. Over the last few years, BMW has certainly been refining their plug-in hybrid systems. When their first plug-in hybrid launched, transitions between electric mode and hybrid mode definitely weren't as smooth as they could be, and the braking, although I think done better than what we see in Toyota hybrids, was still not as smooth as I would like. And this is certainly smoother than that. Transitions between electric mode, like I'm in here, I'm able to climb this hill even at 40, 50 miles an hour in 100% electric mode, but transitions to hybrid mode, if I need more power, they actually are pretty smooth. It feels sort of like a regular transmission downshift. And the same thing happens when I switch back to electric mode. I'm climbing this hill now in electric mode, and the engine just turned off, and it didn't feel weird. It didn't feel like there was a weird stumble as one power source turned off and the other power source took over. Now that said, there's obviously still a blending of power sources going on here, and the electric motor is still driving the vehicle through the 8-speed automatic transmission. So this is not really going to feel like a pure electric vehicle necessarily out on the road, and it's obviously not going to be quite as smooth as the non-hybrid 330, but the difference is honestly pretty small. Now the tricky thing with the 330e is that honestly, there's not too much difference in fuel economy either. Unless you're really doing a lot of stop and go or slow and go traffic, the 330i and the 330e are going to be pretty close when it comes to fuel economy. The rationale for buying a plug-in hybrid like this is of course plugging it in, because if you don't plug it in, you're not really going to be saving much fuel. But on the other hand, if you do plug it in, the average consumer could save about 2 gallons of gasoline a day, assuming you can plug it in on both ends of your commute. You would therefore be able to satisfy almost your entire average weekly consumption just by moving that over to gasoline. And then you could use gasoline for your weekend trips or your longer trips away. Obviously, if you had a longer commute, you wouldn't be able to go that entire way electricity only, but you would be able to have a significant reduction in your gasoline consumption. Now let's take a deeper dive into pricing. As I said, the 330e is the least expensive BMW 3 Series, but there's some asterisks here, so let's dive into that. The BMW 330i starts at $41,250. The 330e starts at $44,550, but has a $5,836 federal tax credit on it. Logically, most people that are shopping for a $40,000 BMW are going to qualify for the full federal tax credit, so definitely keep that in mind. That makes it about $2,500 less expensive than the 330i, and BMW for some reason offers cheaper financing on the 330e than the 330i. To be perfectly honest, the 330e is an absolute no-brainer if you're going to be buying your BMW 3 Series. The tricky part here is what happens if you decide to lease your 3 Series? Well, then the 330e ends up being a little bit more expensive for some reason. The likely reason for that is that the leasing company does not get the full federal tax credit when they lease you a vehicle. They still own the vehicle, they retain the title, but they don't get that full tax credit. They get a subset of it, and therefore the leasing cost may be a little bit different. Currently, right now in the United States, there's a $419 lease special going on the 330i, but it goes up to $449 if you get the 330e. Why am I talking about leases? It's quite simple. BMW 3 Series, Mercedes-Benz C-Classes, Audi A4s, etc., they generally lease at least double the national average lease rate. So about 50 to 60% of BMW 3 Series are going off the lots as leases rather than purchases. Now, it's not all bad news for people that are considering leasing a 330e because you do get access to California's carpool lanes and some other states that offer similar benefits. You'll also get improved fuel economy, reduced emissions, and the ability to shift some of your consumption over to electricity. Whether or not you'll save the $30 difference monthly is a little bit up in the air, but depending on your situation, it is definitely possible. And aside from that, in California, I would say that the carpool stickers are probably worth $30 a month. To be perfectly honest, the most direct competitor to the BMW 330e is the BMW 330i. But because I've already been talking about that at length in this video, let's just breeze right through this slide, say you should simply buy the 330e because I think it's better, and move on to its only other real natural competitor in the US at the moment, the Volvo S60 T8. There are other hybrids out there. You could get a Lexus hybrid, but not a Lexus IS hybrids. There's really nothing else quite like it other than the Volvo S60, which is about the same size, comes from Europe, is a plug-in hybrid as well. But the formula for creating the S60 plug-in hybrid is quite different than the BMW 330e. The first and most important thing to know is that this is a range-topping model for Volvo as far as drivetrains go. So 400 horsepower, 472 pound-feet of torque, or 415 horsepower if you choose the optional Polestar engineered model, so it is considerably more powerful than the 330e. But there's some additional compromises, because the Volvo S60 starts out as a front-wheel drive vehicle, not a rear-wheel drive vehicle. And when Volvo decides to plug-in hybridize their vehicles, they delete the mechanical all-wheel drive system and they put a big battery pack in the center tunnel. So it does reduce your storage capacity in the center console and make that center console just a little bit chunkier than it would be in the regular S60, but the trunk space does not change at all. On the other hand, the BMW 3 Series still has a bigger trunk in the plug-in hybrid model because its trunk is just really big for this category, period. As far as driving dynamics go, the BMW 3 Series is going to be the clear winner here. It has a better weight balance than we find in the Volvo S60. Its rear-wheel drive or mechanical all-wheel drive system that's still going to send the majority of power to the rear axle, whereas the Volvo S60 is honestly a little bit of an odd duck. A little over 315 horsepower happens on the front axle. The balance happens on the rear axle with an electric motor. So it is somewhat like the Lexus E all-wheel drive systems that we find in the RX and the NX hybrid, but with a Volvo twist. And the Volvo twist is it sends an awful lot more power to the rear axle. The way that plays out in real-world driving is that sometimes it can feel like a front-wheel drive car. You can get a little bit of torque steer, but if you crank the wheel really hard one side to the other and you floor it, you'll get torque steer and oversteer at the same time. It's a really peculiar feeling. It is sort of fun, but definitely unusual. The BMW, on the other hand, handles just like a BMW with a little bit of extra weight in the rear. 0 to 60 times in the Volvo are going to be quite a bit faster than the 330e. It goes 0 to 60 in 4.2 seconds, which is an awful lot closer to the M340i than the BMW 330i, so definitely keep that in mind. Because of the drivetrain design and the fact that it doesn't have a mechanical rear differential, it actually gets slightly better fuel economy than we find in the BMW 330e, but the electric range is just a little bit shorter. Volvo's infotainment system takes a little bit of getting used to. I don't think it's quite as slick as BMW's iDrive. It is getting replaced soon, however, so if you're watching this video after, say, mid-2021, keep in mind that the S60 is probably going to be getting the new Google infotainment system that we find in the XC40 Recharge and the upcoming C40. We do see that expanding across the Volvo lineup, and Volvo tends to roll these updates out pretty quickly, so it's probably going to be in the S60, if not for 2022, perhaps even a mid-cycle refresh. The downside to the Volvo is the price tag. It's going to be more expensive. Because the battery pack is a little bit smaller, the federal tax credit isn't quite as large, it's going to be about $3,000 more to buy as well. And if you want to comparably equip it to some versions of the BMW 330e, that delta may grow a little bit. Because the base model of the Volvo plug-in hybrid is the R design, and it doesn't have as much feature content on it as we find in the Inscription or in the Polestar engineered trims, which are definitely going to be more expensive and will go on up to about $66,000. Which one would I pick if my own money were on the line? I'm actually going to split that question just a little bit and say that if I was looking to spend under $50,000, I would get the BMW 330e. Especially the base version, I think, is an absolutely great value. The driving dynamics are excellent, the fuel economy is excellent, and I love the smoothness of BMW's latest plug-in hybrid system. If, however, I was looking to spend a little bit more, or perhaps I wanted that quicker acceleration that we find in the S60 T8, now called the S60 Recharge, that is definitely where I would go. I love the look of the S60 a little bit more than the BMW's exterior design, and I think that I would be willing to give up some of the driving dynamics that obviously are better in the BMW for the extra thrust that we find in the Volvo. The Volvo really is a low compromise. I wouldn't say no compromise plug-in hybrid. I think the BMW 330e truly is a no compromises plug-in hybrid. The Volvo, on the other hand, is sort of a low compromise hybrid because the driving dynamics are a little bit unusual, but you get an awful lot of thrust in compensation and 27 mpg. Let me know what you would buy if you were shopping in this segment down there in the comment section below, or would you just skip a plug-in hybrid altogether and want to go full EV rather than this midway step of gasoline mitigation rather than gasoline elimination? Let me know down there. Find me over at facebook.com/AlexNauto so you can see what I'm driving this week, over at Instagram, all those other social places, and I'll see all of you later.